Putin will take that as a signal that he can continue. And so this is the moment. Europe has to step up to the mark, increase defense spending, a clarion call to Ukraine from across Europe and Canada too as part of this equation, that we will support them.
Yes, and I remember very well sitting in this chair 3 years ago at this moment when Putin's forces began a dash for Kyiv and his missiles rained down on the city. This was how Times Radio covered it at the time.
Good morning, it's 6 o'clock. This is Asma Mir and Stig Abel with Times Radio Breakfast.
The headlines. Explosions are heard around Ukraine as President Putin launches a military operation. President Biden says he will hold Russia to account, and Boris Johnson promises the UK will respond decisively.
Ahead, we'll be live in Kiev and Moscow.
This is going to be about as bad as anything we've seen since the Second World War. We must assume the worst. We must assume that Putin is planning to occupy Ukraine. That means that the world we live in has changed fundamentally, that there is a very real prospect of this spilling into NATO territory, the eastern countries of the NATO alliance, and that we all, 30 NATO members, could find ourselves at war with Russia before too long.
That was the instant reaction within hours of Russia's invasion by General Sir Richard Shirreff. He's the former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. I remember vividly him saying those words 3 years ago, and I'm delighted to say we can speak to him again this morning. Morning, Richard.
Good morning, Stig.
It didn't quite get as bad as it could have done, but what's your initial thoughts 3 years on?
You're right, it didn't get as bad initially as it could have done. And that is down to the extraordinary resilience, courage, determination, and ingenuity of Ukraine and the Ukrainians who fought and won the Battle of Kiev and then the battles around Kharkiv subsequently. But I stick by what I said about the threat posed by Russia. Particularly, and in a sense, what we've seen is, yes, Ukraine has defended itself, Europe has stepped up to the mark, and America stepped up to the mark in providing equipment, ammunition, and the means to fight the war. But what we have lacked is a clear strategy in NATO and across the Western Alliance to defeat Russia in Ukraine, because the only way that we are going to enjoy peace long term in Europe, in the transatlantic region, and of course, most importantly, in Ukraine, is if Russia is defeated in Ukraine. And that seems further away than ever now after the appeasement and potential capitulation of Trump after his recent announcement, and America's effectively turning its or surrendering its leadership of the free world, abdicating its free world, and stating that it will not underpin European security in the future.
We'll get to Trump in a second, but were we ultimately too scared to fight Russia in Ukraine? Is that what it boils down to, that we were always willing to give a bit of support, but never quite enough support? We talked a good game about Ukraine winning this war, but we never really enabled them to win it outright on the battlefield. Were we kind of neither one thing nor another for the first 3 years of the conflict?
You're right, we were. And that was absolutely, that attitude of self-deterrence was led by President Biden and the last American administration, coupled with slogans such as we're with you all the way, we're with you as long as it takes. These are slogans, not strategies. And the only way things would have changed would have been a determination and a will and a recognition that Russia poses a threat not just to Ukraine, but to the whole of Europe and the transatlantic region, and therefore must be stopped. And the self-deterrence that was practiced largely by Biden and the rest of Europe, and the refusal and the unwillingness to really double down and understand that a complete mindset shift needed to be made if Ukraine was to achieve victory over Russia.
And now Trump's talking to Putin. There's no real prospect of Putin being defeated. Trump doesn't even want to defeat him, I don't think.
Well, I push back at that. It all depends on Europe. And this is the moment, well, arguably in the last couple of weeks, ever since Trump announced that he'd done it effectively, was doing a deal with Putin over the head of Ukraine. This is the moment that Europe has to step up to the mark. If Europe doesn't step up to the mark, then Russia is likely to achieve its aims long term. It's not going to happen immediately, but if there's a deal, a ceasefire deal, which gives Russia a significant amount of what Putin wants, his maximalist aims have never changed, then he will declare victory and he will rebuild his armed forces and have another go at completing the conquest of Ukraine. And then he will move on. He's already moved on in Moldova, Georgia, and indeed he's trying it on in Romania with the electoral manipulation there. And don't forget, the Baltic states, former annexed states of the Soviet Union, formerly part of the Tsarist Empire, seen by Russia as rightfully theirs, he will almost certainly have a go there if he sees, as he has done, the dissension and the divide within NATO. And herein lies the challenge, because what Trump has done is effectively, and is doing, is effectively giving on a plate to Putin what he wants. The long-term neutralization of Ukraine. He's demanding elections in Ukraine. He wants to put a puppet government into Ukraine. And then he's effectively ruled out Ukrainian NATO membership. And I can see the way things are going, and that he's effectively decoupled America from European security. He's neutralized NATO. And Putin will take that as a signal that he can continue. And so this is the moment. Europe has to step up to the mark, increase defense spending, a clarion call to Ukraine from across Europe and Canada too as part of this equation, that we will support them. Yes, we can't do what the Americans can do, but we should be saying we will do everything we can to fill the gaps left by the Americans and give you everything it needs to defeat Russia. And that requires a fundamental change in this country and in the other countries of Europe.
Richard, it's no less a gloomy message, perhaps, but there's something there. There's something there to be done, at least 3 years after the initial invasion of Ukraine. Great to speak to you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
That's General Sir Richard Shirreff. He was there with us 3 years ago. He's giving his analysis 3 years on. Let's talk to Catherine Philp, who's the Times World Affairs editor, joins us live from Ukraine. She's been a great guide to what's been going on in that country over the last few weeks and the months before that. Catherine, morning to you.
Good morning, Stig.
Hearing there's a moment for Europe to step up. I wonder how much the people in Ukraine, people in Kyiv feel that that's likely. They feel confident that's going to give them what they need.
Look, the people who've arrived in Kyiv this morning to help Ukraine mark this third anniversary of the invasion are all European leaders. They are definitely seen as perhaps a steadier allies than Trump is proving to be, much to the disappointment of many Ukrainians who had kind of lost faith in Joe Biden. But Zelensky gave one of his very long press conferences that he does on the anniversaries, to mark the anniversaries yesterday. And he said, we can't lose the US, we can't afford to. And so that they still have to be part of any future plan. And
there's a danger, of course, that they might well have already lost the US. Trump doesn't like Zelensky. Trump doesn't seem that interested in Ukraine. Trump is already speaking over Ukrainian heads to Putin. Now, the positive side, people sometimes say to us is, well, hang on a second, Trump is at least talking about peace. Trump recognises that the war can't go on forever. That's sensible. He's moving the pieces in the puzzle and we'll get something good at the end. Is that the optimistic view? Because the pessimistic view would be Trump doesn't care at all and you've got Europe or you've got nothing.
Well, again, Zelensky made a remark during his press conference yesterday that I thought was quite interesting and worrying too about what Trump's motivations might be. He warned that Trump was likely to see a ceasefire as an end to the war, that he would kind of bank that win, and that would be that. But that it would be a ceasefire that would allow Putin to come right back in. I mean, Whether that's all Trump wants, to be able to call himself a deal maker, remains to be seen. In what time frame might the Russians come back? Would he get away with it? Would it look like a peace for the rest of his term? These are all open questions. I think that obviously Europe has got more than just Ukraine to think about in this. It's also considering the defense of its own borders, not including Ukraine, and what this new posture of President Trump means for security across the whole of Europe. So there's a hell of a lot to be worked out here.
The Nobel Peace Prize, it strikes me, is quite a short-term award, and if you basically make the right noises at the right time, you can win it. And there's some talk that's what Donald Trump wants to do with all of this and doesn't care much beyond that. Just finally, Catherine, Zelensky said he was willing to exchange his job for NATO membership for security for Ukraine. How serious was that? Has he gone in after a ceasefire? Is he gone in a year if they have elections? What did you take from that little moment in the press conference?
Well, I think it's important to put it in context, because he didn't offer that up himself. He was asked, would you trade your presidency for peace? And he said, if it's a real peace, yes. And then he said, and NATO membership. So he sort of upped the ante there. Now, his point is that a ceasefire is not a peace. They are different things. Your nod there to the Nobel Peace Prize that we know Trump is keen on getting. I don't think he'd get it for a ceasefire, not just because the antipathy, I imagine, towards him in amongst those who make that choice, but also because the Nobel Peace Prize, as well as the world, have been here before. Henry Kissinger got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 in Vietnam, 2 years before the North Vietnamese swept the entire country and Saigon fell. He actually offered to give it back, which I wouldn't imagine Trump would do if he did get it. But he retained it, and yet his peace fell apart very dramatically.
Yeah, and that's the great fear in all of this. And it's such a good point that ceasefire is not peace is a little note we should write down to ourselves when we're having the conversations in the next few days and weeks to come. Catherine, great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Catherine Philp there, live from Kyiv. She's the Times' World Affairs editor.
It is also worth pointing out, and we will talk about this, of course, on the programme today, the German elections dominating what's happening in Europe just today. Friedrich Merz, who's the new German Chancellor, he's been really bullish when it comes to what happens next with Ukraine, and particularly on the relationship with America. He said Europe needs to achieve independence from America because Trump is indifferent to the fate of Europe. And on whether NATO will exist, he questioned whether it could in its current form, even by the time of June's NATO summit. So, although he's a very new leader, he's got to build his coalition. He's saying he's going to do that very quickly. It'll be fascinating to see what Merz does in terms of, knocking Europe into a new position on America, Russia and Ukraine, and potentially being pretty bullish on it, where maybe Olaf Scholz, his predecessor, wasn't.
And maybe the future of NATO is not NATO. It's not the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. It's Europe. It's what Richard Shirreff was basically, and Canada, basically.
And which seems to be exactly what Merz is saying too. But the reality of that requires more spending and more commitment on troop numbers, and that's a big open question.